The warm summer breeze carried the fading sounds of hymns as Mrs. Dorothy Williams stepped out of the First Hope Church. She'd been attending the Wednesday evening prayer group for over 30 years now, finding peace in the familiar faces and gentle songs that filled the old brick building. At 68, she walked a bit slower these days, but she never missed a meeting. The streetlights were just starting to flicker on as she made her way down Malcolm Street, her well-worn Bible tucked safely in her arms. She'd gotten it as a gift from her late husband James, and its pages were filled with little notes and bookmarks from years of faithful study. The neighborhood had changed a lot since they'd first moved here in the 1970s. New shops, new families, new buildings, but this walk home had remained her constant companion. Mrs. Williams smiled as she passed Mr. Chen's corner store, where the kind shop owner was bringing in his fruit stand for the night. He waved at her like he did every Wednesday, and she waved back. Her mind wandered to the banana bread she was planning to bake tomorrow for the community center's weekend fundraiser. The kids there always loved her baking, especially little Tommy from apartment 4B who'd lost his mother last year. The peaceful evening air suddenly filled with the harsh sound of screeching tires. A police car pulled up sharply to the curb beside her, its headlights blazing bright in the growing darkness. Mrs. Williams squinted, raising her hand to shield her eyes as two officers quickly stepped out of the vehicle. "Ma'am, stop right there," the taller officer called out, his hand already resting on his belt. "There's been a robbery reported at the convenience store 3 blocks from here." Mrs. Williams's heart began to race, but she kept her composure, just as she had taught her students to do during her 35 years as a teacher. "Officers," she said calmly, "I'm just walking home from church. I've been there all evening with Reverend Johnson and the prayer group." The second officer moved closer, his flashlight beam dancing across her face. "You match the description we received. Female, dark clothing, carrying a bag." His voice was cold, professional, lacking any hint of humanity. "This isn't a bag, officer," Mrs. Williams explained patiently, holding up her Bible. "It's my Bible. I can show you my ID. I live just 2 blocks from here, been in the same house for 45 years. She slowly reached for her purse, movements deliberate and careful, just as her son, a lawyer in Atlanta, had advised her to do if she ever encountered law enforcement. "Don't move," the first officer shouted, causing Mrs. Williams to freeze. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her voice steady, drawing on decades of experience handling difficult situations in her classroom. "I'm just reaching for my identification, officers. I'm Mrs. Dorothy Williams. I taught at Washington Heights Elementary for 35 years. Many of your colleagues' children were in my class. Officer Thompson's daughter Jenny just graduated last year. You can call him to verify." But the officers weren't listening. The taller one grabbed her arm roughly, causing her to drop her beloved Bible. It fell to the sidewalk with a thud, its pages splaying open, some of her precious notes scattering in the evening breeze. "Please," she said, her voice cracking slightly as she watched a paper with James's handwriting flutter away. "That Bible was a gift from my late husband. The notes inside are all I have left of him." The second officer was already reaching for his handcuffs. Mrs. Williams felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she held them back, remembering the dignity her mother had taught her to maintain, even in the face of injustice. She said a silent prayer, asking for strength and protection as the situation spiraled further out of control. The sound of their radios crackled through the tense air, mixing with the distant sounds of traffic and the evening calls of birds settling in for the night. A small group of onlookers had begun to gather, their worried whispers creating a soft backdrop to the unfolding scene. Among them was Mr. Chen, who had stepped out of his store upon hearing the commotion, his face etched with concern for his longtime customer and friend. Just when things seemed darkest, the roar of a powerful engine cut through the evening air. Nobody on that quiet Brooklyn street could have guessed that fate was about to intervene in the most unexpected way, bringing help from the most unlikely of sources. The next few moments would change everything, not just for Mrs. Williams, but for an entire community that had grown too accustomed to looking the other way. The evening air grew heavier as Mrs. Williams stood there, her heart pounding against her chest. The fallen Bible lay at her feet, its pages rustling in the gentle breeze like wounded birds. She could see her husband James's favorite psalm exposed to the night air, his careful handwriting still visible in the margins after all these years. "Officers, please," she said, keeping her voice steady despite her growing fear. "Let me show you my ID. It's right here in my purse." Her fingers trembled as she tried to reach for the small leather bag that hung at her side, the same one her granddaughter had given her last Christmas. "I said don't move." The taller officer snapped, his grip tightening on her arm. Mrs. Williams winced, but didn't cry out. She'd lived through the civil rights era, had seen worse days than this, but somehow this felt different. More personal, more painful. Mr. Chen, still watching from his store entrance, stepped forward. "Officers, I know this lady. She comes by my store every Wednesday after church. Been doing so for 20 years. His voice carried the weight of truth, but the officers paid him no attention. The second officer moved closer, his badge catching the streetlight's glow. "Ma'am, you're not listening to instructions. That's resisting." His words sent a chill down Mrs. Williams's spine. She'd heard stories about how situations like this could spiral out of control, had warned her own children and grandchildren about staying calm, following instructions. Now here she was, living through what she'd always prayed would never happen. The growing crowd of onlookers shifted nervously. Someone whispered about calling for help. Another person had already pulled out their phone to record. Mrs. Williams could hear the soft murmur of prayers from an elderly woman standing nearby, her hands clasped tightly together. "My son is a lawyer," Mrs. Williams said quietly, trying one last time to reason with them. "He works with the ACLU in Atlanta. Please just let me make one phone call." She thought of her son Anthony, how many times he'd represented people in situations just like this. How many times he told her, "Mama, it's not right, but you've got to stay calm if it happens to you." Instead of listening, the officers exchanged a look that made Mrs. Williams's blood run cold. The taller one reached for his handcuffs while the other one started pushing her toward the patrol car. Her legs buckled slightly, but she fought to stay upright, dignity intact, just as her mother had taught her. "I can't believe this is happening," a young woman in the crowd said loudly. "Someone needs to do something." The murmurs grew louder. Phones recording the scene glinted in the darkness like fireflies, but nobody dared to step forward. Not yet. Mrs. Williams felt the cold metal of handcuffs against her wrist and closed her eyes. She thought of her late husband James, how he'd always told her to hold her head high no matter what. She thought of her classroom at Washington Heights Elementary, where she'd taught generations of children about justice and fairness. What would they think if they could see their beloved teacher now? The rough concrete of the wall scraped against her arm as they pushed her against it. Her church hat, the purple one she'd worn to countless Sunday services, fell to the ground next to her Bible. She could hear more cars stopping, more voices joining the crowd. The situation was drawing attention, but would anyone actually help? A tear finally escaped, rolling down her cheek as she heard one of the officers' radio for backup. "Subject resisting arrest," he said into his radio, words that made her heart sink even further. She'd done nothing wrong, nothing at all, except walk home from church like she had every Wednesday for the past 3 decades. The gathering crowd's energy was shifting from nervous whispers to angry mutters. Someone shouted, "She's just an old lady." Another voice called out, "This isn't right." The tension in the air was building like a thunderstorm about to break. And then it happened. The deep rumble of a powerful engine cut through the chaos. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the scene like dark mirrors. The crowd's attention shifted, and even the officers paused for a moment. Nobody could have guessed that inside that car sat someone who was about to change everything. The car door opened slowly, and a figure emerged that would transform this moment from a tragedy into something entirely different. The air seemed to crackle with electricity as heavy footsteps approached, and a voice that millions would recognize spoke out from the darkness. "What do you think you're doing to this lady?" The streetlight caught Mike Tyson's face as he stepped out of his car, his expression a mixture of concern and controlled anger. He just finished dinner at his favorite Brooklyn restaurant, a quiet place where the owner still treated him like family. The evening was supposed to be peaceful, but sometimes life had other plans. He heard the commotion before he saw it, the raised voices, the crowd's worried murmurs, and most importantly, the sound of an elderly woman's dignified pleas. It hit too close to home. He thought of his own mother, how she used to walk these same streets. How many times had she faced similar treatment? How many times had she come home with tears in her eyes that she tried to hide from him? "I'm going to ask one more time," Tyson said, his voice carrying the weight of his years in and out of the ring. "What are you doing to this lady?" He moved closer, his steps measured and deliberate. The crowd parted like water, phone still recording, but now with a new energy in the air. One of the officers turned, recognition flickering across his face. It wasn't every day you came face to face with a former heavyweight champion of the world. "Sir, this is a police matter. Please step back." The officer's voice wavered slightly, his hand still gripping Mrs. Williams's arm. Tyson shook his head slowly. "No, I don't think I will." He pulled out his phone and started recording. "I want to understand why two grown men are manhandling someone's grandmother on a public street, someone who was just walking home from church." His voice was calm but firm, the voice of someone who'd learned the hard way that control was more powerful than chaos. Mrs. Williams looked up, her eyes meeting Tyson's. There was something in that look that struck him deep, dignity in the face of injustice. It reminded him of all the strong women who'd shaped his life, who'd faced their own battles with that same quiet strength. "My name is Mike Tyson," he announced, though everyone knew who he was. "And I'm going to stand right here and make sure this lady is treated with respect." He moved closer, positioning himself where both officers could see him clearly. "Now, why don't we all take a breath and handle this properly?" The growing crowd murmured with approval. Someone had picked up Mrs. Williams's Bible and hat, holding them carefully like precious artifacts. Mr. Chen from the corner store had moved closer too, standing near Tyson with his arms crossed. She dropped her ID. A young voice called from the crowd, and a small envelope was passed forward. Tyson took it and held it up to the officers. "Here's her identification. Why don't we start with that instead of assumptions?" The taller officer's grip on Mrs. Williams loosened slightly. The situation was shifting, and everyone could feel it. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about right and wrong, about standing up when it mattered. Tyson stepped even closer, his phone steady in his hand. "I've seen this story too many times," he said, his voice carrying years of witnessed injustice. "But tonight, we're going to write a different ending." He gestured to his car, where his driver had stepped out, also recording. "We've got multiple videos going now. The whole world's going to see how this ends." Mrs. Williams stood straighter, drawing strength from this unexpected alliance. The handcuffs hadn't been fully secured yet, and now they hung awkwardly from one wrist. The second officer looked at his partner, uncertainty clear in his expression. "You know what I learned in the ring?" Tyson continued, addressing everyone but looking directly at the officers. "The biggest fights aren't always about throwing punches. Sometimes they're about standing your ground, about being there when it counts." He gestured to the crowd. "Look around. Everyone here is a witness. Everyone here is waiting to see if justice still means something in Brooklyn." A patrol supervisor's car pulled up, lights flashing but no siren. Word had gotten up the chain of command. Mike Tyson was involved in a situation on Malcolm Street. The atmosphere crackled with possibility. Change was coming, riding on the wings of unexpected courage and perfect timing. Mrs. Williams's quiet voice cut through the tension. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 45 years, she said, her words carrying the weight of decades. "I've seen it change, seen it grow. But I never thought I'd see the day when a champion would step out of the darkness to help a teacher like me." Tyson smiled at her words, but his eyes stayed serious, focused. This moment wasn't about him, it was about something bigger. Something that had been building in cities across America, something that needed people to stand up, speak out, make a difference. The supervisor stepped out of his car, taking in the scene. The crowd with their phones, Mike Tyson standing firm, Mrs. Williams with her quiet dignity, and his officers caught in the crosshairs of a situation gone wrong. Everything was about to change, and everyone present could feel it in the air. The patrol supervisor, Captain Richards, sized up the situation quickly. 25 years on the force had taught him how to read a scene, and this one was a powder keg. Mike Tyson stood like a guardian angel next to Mrs. Williams, his phone still recording, while dozens of community members watched with their own phones raised. "What's the situation here?" the captain asked, his voice cutting through the tension. Before either officer could respond, Tyson stepped forward, his presence commanding but controlled. "I'll tell you what the situation is," Tyson said, keeping his phone steady. "These officers stopped this lady walking home from church, wouldn't let her show ID, and were about to arrest her for no reason." He gestured to the Bible and church hat still being carefully held by one of the onlookers. "Does she look like a robbery suspect to you?" Mrs. Williams spoke up, her voice stronger now with Tyson beside her. "I tried to explain that I've lived here for decades. I taught at Washington Heights Elementary. Many of your officers' children were my students." She looked directly at Captain Richards. "Your youngest daughter was in my class just 5 years ago, Captain. Remember the Mother's Day card she made you?" I helped her with the spelling. Recognition flickered across the captain's face. Memory hit him like a splash of cold water. "Mrs. Williams?" he said, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. "My Lisa still talks about you. She's in college now, studying to be a teacher because of you." The atmosphere shifted subtly. The younger officers looked uncomfortable, realizing they'd made a serious error in judgment. Mr. Chen stepped forward again, holding up his phone. "I have security camera footage from my store," he said. "It shows Mrs. Williams walking past at her usual time, just like every Wednesday after church." Tyson nodded approvingly. "You see, this is what community looks like. Everyone here knows who she is, what she means to this neighborhood." But these officers didn't bother to listen, didn't bother to check. His words carried weight, but there was no anger in them, just truth. Captain Richards turned to his officers. "Remove those handcuffs." Now, his tone left no room for argument. As the metal cuffs fell away from Mrs. Williams's wrist, someone in the crowd started to clap. The sound spread like ripples in a pond. "I want to be clear about something," Tyson said, addressing the growing crowd as much as the officers. "This isn't about making anybody look bad. It's about making things right. It's about treating people with respect, about listening before acting." He placed a gentle hand on Mrs. Williams's shoulder. "It's about protecting our elders, our teachers, our community members." Mrs. Williams rubbed her wrist where the handcuff had been, but her eyes were clear and focused. "I've taught hundreds of children over the years," she said, looking at the young officers. "I always told them that mistakes aren't what define you. It's how you handle them, how you learn from them." The younger officers shifted uncomfortably, but Captain Richards stepped in. "Mrs. Williams is right. And on behalf of the department, I want to apologize." He turned to address the crowd. "This isn't how we're supposed to operate. This isn't what protect and serve means." Someone brought Mrs. Williams her Bible and hat. As she took them, her hands trembling slightly, Tyson noticed a few loose papers falling from the Bible's pages. He bent down to pick them up, notes in careful handwriting, memories of a life well lived scattered on the sidewalk. "Let me help you collect these," he said softly, gathering the precious notes. "My mother used to write in her Bible too, said it was like having a conversation with God." He carefully tucked the papers back between the pages, treating them with the respect they deserved. The crowd had started to thin, but those who remained were watching something important unfold. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about community, about standing together, about turning a moment of injustice into an opportunity for change. Captain Richards was already on his radio, calling in a formal report. The young officers stood to the side, their earlier bravado replaced by what looked like genuine reflection. Mr. Chen had disappeared back into his store, returning with a chair for Mrs. Williams and a bottle of water. "You know," Tyson said, making sure his phone caught everything, "people often ask me about my biggest fights. They think it's all about what happened in the ring." He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. "But the real fights, they happen right here on the streets. They happen when we choose to stand up for what's right, when we protect each other, when we make sure everyone gets treated with dignity." Mrs. Williams took a sip of water, her composure fully restored. "In my classroom," she said, "I'd always had one rule above all others: treat everyone the way you want to be treated." She looked at the young officers, not with anger, but with the patient understanding of a lifetime educator. "That rule doesn't stop being important when you grow up. If anything, it becomes more important." The night air had grown cooler, but something warm had taken root in that Brooklyn street. Something that spoke of change, of hope, of community coming together when it mattered most. The The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Word spread through Brooklyn faster than a summer thunderstorm. Within hours, the videos were everywhere. Mike Tyson, the former heavyweight champion, standing up for Mrs. Williams. But what happened next showed that sometimes the biggest changes come after the cameras stop rolling. "Let me drive you home," Tyson said to Mrs. Williams, still holding his phone but no longer recording. The crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving behind a changed street. Captain Richards was still there, overseeing the situation's final moments with a thoughtful expression. Mrs. Williams smiled, clutching her Bible close. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Tyson. But I think I'd like to walk, if you don't mind joining me. These streets have been my evening companion for decades. I'm not about to let fear change that." Tyson nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll walk with you then. My car can follow behind." He turned to Captain Richards. "I trust there won't be any more misunderstandings tonight." The captain shook his head. "No, sir. And I'll be having a long talk with these officers about proper community policing." He looked at Mrs. Williams. "We'll be making some changes in our training programs. Maybe we could use your help with that, Mrs. Williams? Your perspective would be valuable." As they walked down the familiar streets, Mrs. Williams told Tyson stories about the neighborhood. She pointed out the buildings where her former students lived, the changes she'd seen over the years, the small victories and everyday struggles that made up life in Brooklyn. "You know," she said, pausing near a small community garden, "I've always told my students that strength isn't about muscles or power. It's about knowing when to stand up, when to speak out, and when to show compassion." She looked at Tyson with wise eyes. "You showed all three tonight." Tyson listened, really listened as they walked. He thought about his own journey, the mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned. "Sometimes," he replied, "life puts you exactly where you need to be. I was angry when I first saw what was happening, but then I remembered something my trainer Cuss used to say. It's not about the power of the punch, it's about the precision of the response." They'd passed Mr. Chen's store again, now closed for the night. The shopkeeper had waited until he saw them walking back before turning off his lights, offering a respectful nod through the window. Other neighbors watched from their windows too, some waving, others simply bearing witness to this unexpected pair making their way through the night. "Tomorrow," Mrs. Williams said, "I'll bake my banana bread for the community center like I planned. Life goes on, but maybe it goes on a little different now." She adjusted her purple hat, now a symbol of resilience. "Those young officers, they're not bad people. They just forgot to see the human being in front of them." Tyson agreed. "That's the real fight, isn't it? Getting people to see each other as human beings." He chuckled softly. "In the ring, you know who your opponent is. Out here, sometimes the opponent is just our own assumptions, our own fear." They turned onto Mrs. Williams's street, where concerned neighbors were already gathering on their porches. Old Mrs. Thompson from next door rushed down her steps, worry clear on her face. "Dorothy, we saw it all over social media. Are you okay?" Mrs. Williams straightened her shoulders. "I'm more than okay, Helen. I'm blessed. Look who God sent to walk me home." She gestured to Tyson with a gentle smile. "Sometimes angels wear boxing gloves." The small crowd of neighbors gathered closer, but respectfully, sensing the importance of the moment. Someone had already put on a pot of coffee. Another neighbor was bringing out chairs to the porch. This was how community worked, people coming together, turning darkness into light. "You should join us for coffee, Mr. Tyson," Mrs. Williams offered. "I have some pound cake from Sunday's church social, still fresh." Her invitation carried the weight of generations of black mothers and grandmothers who'd turned their homes into sanctuaries. Tyson checked his phone. Dozens of messages already, the video going viral, media requesting statements. But here, on this quiet porch in Brooklyn, was something more important than viral fame. This was about real connection, real change. "I'd like that," he said, settling into a chair as neighbors brought out more food, more chairs, creating an impromptu gathering. Mrs. Williams's porch became a kind of town hall, where people shared their own stories of encounters gone wrong, of fears and hopes, of dreams for a better tomorrow. As the night deepened, something else was happening too. Phones were lighting up across the city, across the country. The video was spreading, but it wasn't just another viral moment of conflict. This was different. This was a story of community, of dignity, of change happening in real time on a Brooklyn street. By morning, the story had taken on a life of its own. News vans lined the quiet Brooklyn street where Mrs. Williams lived, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal sunflowers. But the real story wasn't happening in front of the cameras, it was unfolding in living rooms, coffee shops, and community centers across the city. Mrs. Williams sat in her kitchen, the morning sun streaming through windows that had witnessed 5 decades of her life. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Former students, church members, and even strangers called to offer support. But it was the call from her son, the lawyer in Atlanta, that brought tears to her eyes. "Mama," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I saw the video. I saw how you held your head high, just like you always taught us." He paused, gathering himself. And Mike Tyson, who would have thought? God really does work in mysterious ways. Outside, the community had rallied. Mr. Chen's store became a gathering point, with people bringing coffee and pastries, sharing their own stories. The young officers from last night had returned, not in uniform, but in plain clothes, carrying a handwritten apology letter and asking to speak with Mrs. Williams. "Let them in," she told her neighbor who'd appointed herself doorkeeper for the day. Everyone deserves a chance to make things right. The officers sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd graded papers for 35 years, where she counseled troubled students and comforted grieving parents. "Ma'am," the taller officer began, his badge and swagger gone, replaced by genuine remorse. "What we did was wrong. We forgot our training, forgot our humanity. But most importantly, we forgot that behind every face is a story, a life, a whole world of experiences." Mrs. Williams poured them tea in her best cups, the ones with tiny pink roses that her husband James had bought her for their 40th anniversary. "You know," she said, stirring honey into her cup, "in my classroom, when someone made a mistake, we didn't just punish them. We learned from it. We grew from it. The media wanted interviews, of course, but Mike Tyson had been clear. This story would be told their way, with dignity and purpose." He arrived at Mrs. Williams's house mid-morning, carrying a box of fresh pastries from his favorite bakery and a determination to turn this incident into real change. "The cameras want drama," he told Mrs. Williams as they sat on her porch, watching reporters mill about at a respectful distance. "But we're going to give them something better. We're going to give them truth." Together, they crafted a statement. Not just about what had happened, but about what needed to change. Mrs. Williams spoke about her decades of teaching, about watching generation after generation grow up on these streets. Tyson talked about his own journey, about learning that real strength comes from standing up for others. "We're not here to point fingers," Mrs. Williams told the gathered press, her purple church hat now a symbol of resistance and grace. "We're here to join hands, to show what community really means." She looked at the young officers who'd stopped her, now standing at the back of the crowd. Sometimes the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes. The story spread beyond Brooklyn, beyond New York. People shared their own experiences, their own moments of fear and hope. Mrs. Williams's former students organized a rally, not in anger, but in celebration of community and change. They called it Walking Mrs. Williams Home, and planned to escort elderly residents to and from church services. Captain Richards announced new training programs for his officers, with Mrs. Williams and other community elders as advisors. "We've been policing our neighborhoods," he admitted to the press, "when we should have been protecting our neighbors." By evening, Mrs. Williams's living room had become a kind of command center for positive change. Civil rights leaders sat next to police officers, community organizers next to city officials. They weren't just talking about what went wrong, they were planning how to make things right. "You know what's amazing?" Tyson said, watching the diverse group work together. "Yesterday, this was just another street in Brooklyn. Today, it's where change begins." He looked at Mrs. Williams with respect. "And it all started because you refused to let fear win." Mrs. Williams smiled, touching the Bible that had fallen during the incident. Some of its pages were still creased, but inside, her husband's notes remained, precious reminders of love and faith. "Sometimes," she said, "we don't choose our moments. They choose us. What matters is what we do when they come." As the sun set on another Brooklyn day, the news vans began to leave, but something remained. a sense of possibility, of community, of change in the making. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to show what humanity really means. 1 month later, Mrs. Williams's Wednesday evening walk home from church looked very different. She wasn't alone anymore. Dozens of people joined her, young and old, creating what the neighborhood now called the Walking Wednesday tradition. Tonight was special though, as Mike Tyson had returned to walk with them, keeping a promise he'd made that first night. "Look at this," Tyson said, gesturing to the diverse group walking together. "This is what healing looks like." He'd made it a point to visit regularly, not for publicity, but because something about Mrs. Williams and this community had touched his heart. This is bigger than what happened that night. The changes were visible everywhere. Mr. Chen's store now hosted weekly community meetings where residents and police officers talked openly about neighborhood concerns. The young officers who'd stopped Mrs. Williams had become regular attendees, their initial shame transformed into a commitment to do better. "You know what makes me proudest?" Mrs. Williams said as they walked, her purple hat now accompanied by dozens of others, a symbol of solidarity that had spread through the neighborhood. It's seeing how people stepped up, not just to protest what was wrong, but to build what is right. The community center where she'd once worried about baking enough banana bread was now running at full capacity. New programs had sprung up, legal aid clinics, youth mentoring sessions, and most importantly, a police community partnership program that was already being studied by other precincts. "Yesterday," she continued, "one of my former students, now a police officer himself, brought his rookie partner to meet me. They sat in my kitchen, drinking tea, asking about the neighborhood's history. That's how change happens, one cup of tea at a time." Tyson nodded, understanding the power of small moments. He'd seen how his own presence that night had sparked something, but he knew the real change came from people like Mrs. Williams, people who chose love over fear, wisdom over anger, day after day. As they neared the spot where everything had happened a month ago, someone started singing, an old civil rights song that Mrs. Williams used to teach her students. Other voices joined in, the melody carrying through the evening air like a prayer. "My husband James always said that music could heal what words couldn't touch," Mrs. Williams said softly. "He would have loved this." She patted the Bible she still carried, its pages now containing new notes about new memories, new hopes. The police presence had changed too. Instead of patrol cars cruising by with tinted windows, officers walked the beat, greeting people by name. Captain Richards had made good on his promise. Every new officer now spent time with community elders, learning the neighborhood's stories before ever putting on a badge. At Mrs. Williams's house, the porch lights were already on, welcoming the walking group home. Her neighbors had prepared a small feast, turning the evening into an impromptu block party. Children played under the streetlights while their parents shared stories and food. "You've started something beautiful here," Tyson told Mrs. Williams as they watched the scene unfold. "In the ring, victory is simple. One person wins, one loses. But this is everybody winning." Mrs. Williams smiled, watching a young officer help an elderly neighbor carry her groceries up the steps. "You know what I learned in all my years of teaching? The most important lessons aren't planned. They happen in those moments when we're brave enough to face our mistakes and kind enough to help others learn from them." The foundation they'd started together, the Williams-Tyson Community Bridge Initiative, was already making waves. It wasn't just about police reform, it was about building connections, about turning moments of potential conflict into opportunities for understanding. Next week, Mrs. Williams announced to the gathered crowd, "We're starting our storytelling sessions. Police officers will share their experiences, and community members will share theirs. No judgments, no accusations, just listening and learning." As the evening wound down, someone brought out an old photo album. Pictures of the neighborhood through the years, faces young and old, moments of joy and struggle. Mrs. Williams pointed to a faded photograph of her first class at Washington Heights Elementary. "Every face has a story," she said, her voice carrying the weight of wisdom. "Every story matters. What happened that night could have ended differently. But because people chose to stand up, to speak out, to listen, it became a beginning instead of an ending." Tyson looked at his phone. Another precinct was asking about implementing their program. The media still called, wanting follow-up stories, but the real story was here, in these quiet moments of community building. "You know what's funny?" he said, helping Mrs. Williams collect empty plates from the porch gathering. "People keep asking me why I stopped that night. They don't understand that I didn't just stop for you. I stopped for every mother, every grandmother, every teacher who ever stood their ground with dignity." As the stars began to appear over Brooklyn, the gathered community slowly dispersed, but something remained, a sense of purpose, of possibility, of dreams taking root in concrete soil. The story that began with fear and misunderstanding had grown into something beautiful, a testament to the power of community, courage, and change.